How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Leo Sanders. In part 1, Leo traced his path from civil rights compliance to organization-wide culture work, and he reframed DEI as a lens for helping everybody to succeed. We start this half with why representation matters so much, especially when you want to serve your community well, and how language can either bridge differences or harden divides. From there, we're going to get pretty tactical about building cultures of belonging. So let me ask you this. I think about the comments you're making earlier about recruiting and hiring, where to your point, we tend to think of DEI from that perspective because that's where maybe most people have their exposure to it, or whether they be affirmative action or other kinds of programs. And you were talking about earlier the importance, and certainly we hear about it, of having your workforce be a representative of the community in which you're in. And again, I'm going to ask this with curiosity, not with a point of view. Why does that matter? Why is it important why would it be important for, if I'm an employer, to make sure that my workforce looks similar to the community in which I'm working? I mean, if the community in which I'm working may not have as much talent, why do I care? Why is that important?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we fundamentally challenge, right, is that talent looks a certain way, right? And so if we're approaching and saying, well, this community doesn't have the talent I want, how do you know that, right? Because there's an assumption that's being made there. But I think from a practical standpoint, and I appreciate this because there's an intersection here for me about DEI and the work that you do when you talk about behaviors. And you speak, I think, very elegantly about how values, can sometimes be esoteric, right? They're not the same. And so when you're talking about behaviors, you want to know that, you're having the same kinds of common conversations. Well, we certainly don't want to make the assumption that everybody looks at things the same way. We know, in fact, that they don't, right? Because culture varies, perspective varies. So how do I begin to have common conversations that are going to reach the broadest cross-section of people who I am serving in this case, right? If I have a store that's in a community, I have a brick and mortar store in this community, and I know that I want to provide excellent customer service to them, but I do not have people in my workforce that look like that community. How can I deliver on that? Whatever kinds of common conversations I may be having in my organization that may be perfectly reasonable definitions of what excellent customer service will look like or delivering on results, I don't know that actually connects with this community. I don't know what the norms are. I don't know the way in which they would perceive the things that I think I want to do that to me would define excellence. There's no way for me to really get over there doing that. I could read all kinds of things. I can pull together all kinds of data. But my best opportunity to make sure I'm meeting the needs of the people I serve is to see to it that people who look like the community I serve work inside of my organization.
Got it.
Right? So it's about, again, making sure that the people get to make decisions about what the experiences that people are going to have look like the folks who you are actually intending to impact. And so really, there's a natural tie between I want to actually produce results, and it makes a difference for me to actually reflect the communities and the people that I serve.
Got it. That's helpful. So as we try to do that, what role does language play in this? Because it seems to me that, when we talk about fundamentals and crafting, I sometimes say, one of the benefits of creating fundamentals in an organization, and those of our listeners who've heard my podcasts before know that fundamentals are the title I give to behaviors that we practice in a company. And one of the most common things I hear from leaders is that the fundamentals give them a common language so that we all know what we mean when we say certain things. It seems to me that language plays a huge role in either bringing people together or not. And so talk a little bit about your experience with what role does language play in bringing people together or dividing people?
Yeah, very important part of DEI is language. The understanding of how we get together as people, how we connect to one another as people. As human beings, we exist for one another through language. That is how we connect to one another. And again, we tend to think about DEI, we think about it in a racial context, or we think about it in terms of ability. But just even in terms of something like, again, being a person of faith, when it comes to language, there's conversations to have there inside of community about what are our norms. There may be people who want to deliver a faith-based message and think that that's an important thing to share, and other folks who don't necessarily feel that way. We recall that there was all of this wrangling, and it continues to be over, should you say Merry Christmas? Should you say Happy Holidays, right? And so we have these things, we have these conversations in all of these different ways. We're always looking at, well, what's the language that we want to use? And, there's no real right one answer to that. We have to be engaged in dialogue about it. A lot of times in DEI, when we actually, and this is, again, we're one of those places where DEI far exceeds anything like recruitment or one specific initiative. Once we have an organization that reflects a broad cross-section of who we have in society, we then have to deal with the fact that some of the language we use is insensitive, that it makes people feel different, feel otherized, as we sometimes say, right? And we will call this microaggressions, the small ways in which, words or behaviors could really make someone feel like they don't belong. Where are you from? Where are you from originally? Words like that. And the thing is, this doesn't just affect the people who are the targets of that inside of the organization. It actually goes into the thinking of how the organization thinks about the communities outside of itself. When someone says, there's a you and there's an us, they break community. And this exists at any number of levels. In fact, it's one of those places in which, DEI, I think, really has a lot to bring to conversations about workforce. You will get into conversations about organized labor versus those folks who are not part of the union, right? Those folks who are in the field versus those who are in the office. And they will say, you don't understand us. You don't speak our language. You don't deal with what we're dealing with. And when you really look at the things they say, you could see how that mirrors so many other kinds of conversations where people who are using language to say, you know what, I don't feel connected to you. I don't feel like we're on the same page. You talk about us being one team, but we're not one team. There's a you and there's an us. So DEI really has us look at the language that we use. It has us look at the ways in which we think about one another in the various parts of our organization. And what it aims to do is has us be conscious, have us be responsible about the words that we're using. So we're very intentional. It is not about mongering and saying you can't use this word, you can use that word. I completely get there's training that exists. There are people who will say you should never use these words. And I would certainly be somebody who say you should never set out to intentionally, offend anyone or use something that is offensive to someone. I think that's just a good human thing to do. But really, at its core, what DEI sets to lay out is how do we use language that actually brings us together? How do we use language that allows us to hear one another, that is respectful, and creates the kinds of cultures where people feel like they belong, where they feel safe, where they feel seen and respected? And that is not just about race or gender identity or ability. That is about the full spectrum of the human experience.
So you and I had a previous conversation that I want to, not today, but at a previous time that I want to go back to because I think it's really interesting as it relates to language. And we had talked about once times in which, let's say you're using language that I find offensive or maybe even not so much offensive, but it has me feeling less included, otherized, I'll use your word. And you may be totally unaware of that, just unconscious. You're just using words that are familiar to you and had no clue, with no intention of alienating me, but I feel alienated about that. How do I, if I'm in that position, how do I have a conversation with you that's actually productive and helpful about how that makes me feel? And how do you, as the recipient of that, also engage with me so that we come together instead of just pissing each other off? Sorry for the language.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, we have to, if we're going to have communities at all, right, and I think this is important to culture, we have to honor one another's humanity. If someone says something to me that was offensive, and I know that there's a human being that said that, I don't know what their intention was, but I know what the impact was. I was offended. Then I can say to them, right, and I don't want to make this seem like this is simple, because there are issues of power and there's all kinds of dynamics. But at heart, person to person, it's like, look, that word was offensive that you used, or the way in which you speak to me is offensive because it's creating this experience for me. Now, I want to say that in a way that the other person can hear it. So when we talk about honoring the other's humanity, I don't, it's not going to serve me to be accusatory. If I say you're X because you said that, you said this thing about me that is defamatory toward Black people, therefore you're racist, and that's where I come out, I'm not likely to engage in a productive conversation, right? Because I've made an accusation. You're there not going to react to the accusation. This doesn't mean, I want to be clear, that if someone says a racial slur, that that you ignore that, or that you have to be gentle and welcoming about it. But it does mean that if I actually want to engage in a conversation with you and have a conversation where we move beyond this, it makes a difference for me to point out, hey, the thing that you said was offensive. I don't know if you were clear on that or not, but it was offensive. And here's how it landed for me. It makes a difference that I say that in a way that you can hear it. Now, as the person who is receiving that, it makes a difference that I receive that in a way that acknowledges your humanity. And so, the person then has to say, or has the opportunity to say, either one, got it, I wasn't intending to be offensive. Perhaps I didn't know, or perhaps I thought we had this relationship where it would be okay to say the thing that I did, or I meant that as a joke, and it was a joke. But the responsible thing is to get, I got that this was offensive. And to commit to, here's how I'm going to handle that. Either I'm not going to say that word again. You can certainly ask, help me understand, if it's there for you to help me understand what about that was offensive. I don't think it's incumbent on anybody to educate anybody necessarily. But, if somebody's there and wants to share, I want to understand how that is offensive. They can then say that in a way that allows this then to become a dialogue. It becomes an opportunity to be a point of learning and intersection and healing for a community, and ideally bringing people together. Now, fundamental to that is the commitment to honoring each other's humanity, right? If we're going to have conversations that bring us in community and keep us in community, we have to then think that there's a human being over there that I'm speaking to. They have, their own thoughts, their feelings, their sensitivities. They have egos that they want to protect. There's something going on for them. I have to see the totality of that. And I want to speak in a way that they can hear me. Now, if I'm not committed to that, then I can do all kinds of things, right? I can accuse and it doesn't, that may feel good, but it's not going to bring us any closer. So fundamentally, when it comes to how we use our language in ways that help us heal, that help us actually move past this moment, we have to fundamentally respect and understand and see one another's humanity and speak to one another in a way that acknowledges that, so that what we say gets over there and can be heard.
That's helpful. I often, I'm very focused on language because I think the words we choose mean very different things and frame how we think about things. And I often, when I'm coaching people, I don't talk about the right or the wrong way to handle a situation. I like to use the words more effective or less effective. And so in the example you're giving, if my goal is for us to come together, there are ways that I can have that conversation that increase the likelihood of success. And I I further define effective as increasing the likelihood of getting the outcome that you want. That's effective. Less effective is decreasing that chance. So if I handle it in a certain way and we have this conversation in a particular way, I've increased the probabilities, still no guarantees, but I've increased the probabilities that you and I can connect about this and learn from each other and feel connected about it. If I handle it in other ways, I reduce the chances of that happening. It's not about right or wrong. It's not you did it the right way or the wrong way. It's just, have I done this in a way, have I had this conversation in a way that increases the chances of us being connected and being able to move forward together? And that's really what it's all about.
Exactly right.
And so often
Exactly
the words
right.
right and wrong carry so much other junk with them, so much other garbage that goes with, well, you're saying I'm wrong or you're saying I'm right, when it's really not about that at all. I think about, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I just want to just acknowledge the humanity. So many of the things we talk about, especially today, especially around DEI, are so emotionally charged for people.
Yes.
That I get how difficult it is not to get into the rightness and wrongness of it.
Yes.
I, like anybody else, is susceptible to being like, well, that's wrong and awful and shouldn't happen and shouldn't be said. Right. And I think that the one thing I just want to add to this thinking is it is natural and human to feel that something's right or wrong. We may actually believe something's right or wrong. This is not say, be morally neutral. It is to say, exactly to your point, David, if I'm going to be effective in this conversation with this person, if I want to have an outcome of us being in community or us being close together or able to stay inside a relationship and partnership, I've got to be conscious of how am I going to effectively communicate this?
Yeah. I'm thinking about an example that is I'll call it a mundane example of appreciating language and how it might land in certain audiences based upon their background. And this is a really mundane example, but it illustrates that diversity isn't, to your point, about race or ethnicity or abilities. It's just we're different. And I think about a number of years back, I was writing a set of fundamentals for a client. And in my first company, RSI, we had a fundamental that's one of my favorites. I call it practice A+ness as a way of life. And it was just this idea that, doing high quality, that A is pretty good, but A+ that's really good. And we were writing this for a client, and they had a significant population in Mexico. And somebody shared with me that apparently, I didn't know this, but in Mexican schools, they don't grade with letter grades. And so A+ would not mean anything to them in that community. Now, that's not like I wasn't trying to be offensive to anybody, but okay, that wouldn't make sense to them. And it's sort of a mundane example, but I think it illustrates your point that it isn't really about ethnicity or those other things. It's just, who am I speaking with? And based on their lived experiences, what language would be meaningful for them, or how might something be described in a way that would convey what I'm trying to convey. And lack of sensitivity about that, if we had created it and called it A+ness, that doesn't mean we're bad people or we're wrong or anything else. It's still the right idea. It just isn't going to land with them because it doesn't mean anything to them. And so just being more increasing our awareness of what other experiences, what experiences might other people have, and am I at least conscious of the idea that the language I'm using may, or how is the language that I'm using, how might that land in that particular population? And it's interesting, as I think about, as I'm contemplating this, I've said often that when I think about the fundamentals that we've written in so many companies, a very common theme that comes through in so many different fundamentals, not intentionally, it's just the way it works, is so many fundamentals relate to the ability or the importance of thinking from another person's perspective. And so often we're in our own heads. And what I hear you really saying is DEI is really about thinking from other perspectives and recognizing that the way I'm looking at things is not the only way. It's just what's in my head. And the ability to get out of my own head and imagine how might this feel, look, sound, come across to somebody else is a core part of so many different fundamentals. And what I hear you saying is that's really what DEI is about, is the ability to think from other people's perspective, imagine that, recognize that even that there are other perspectives, and then think about how can we create opportunities for people beyond just me to be able to be successful.
Yeah. And I would say with that, right, to engage in conversations with those other people, to learn from them, to allow that to inform you. And I think that, that's really important, this point, because it is the human to human piece. And a lot of times, again, one of the ways that folks can sort of get curious ideas about DEI is they think, I've got to learn all of these words. I've got to learn all the right terms, all the right.
I might
too much.
Step on. There's a landmine I might step on because I said the wrong thing here.
I can't speak. I remember, for those of us who recall when Time's Up and Me Too happened, there was all of this discussion, like,
Yes.
now you can't work, you can't meet with women, you can't talk to them behind closed doors. And to me, I always thought this was very curious, and so you can imagine, here I am, I'm a man. I work in a woman-led, woman-centered organization.
Yes.
There's no way that I can learn what are all the right words or all the things to do to, there's millions of people who are connected to the league, right? We have this incredible reach. So how am I going to be here and think that I'm going to learn all the right things? Well, of course I can't. But I move with a mindset that I'm going to be responsible and intentional about the words I choose. And if I get feedback that says, hey, this landed a certain way, or, I don't know if you intended this, I'm going to be open and receptive to that. And so it's really not about sort of reading all the books and learning all of these different words. It's about when I meet people and they have an experience that's different than mine, I'm just open to that they have an experience that's different than mine. And I want to be respectful about it. I want to engage in ways that are respectful to them. I want to honor their experience. I certainly get to have my own thoughts and views and perspectives and beliefs, but I want to honor the person that's over there. And I want to be effective with them and letting them know that I honor them and that I see them. And if we just walk with that mindset and expand from that into the things we do, we're going to do DEI naturally.
Yeah. I love that. And I think there's a word that I think about a lot in what you've said. And I think of the word curiosity. That I love that your comment that DEI doesn't mean it's not okay for me to have my points of view about things. It's okay to have my points of view about things. It's an openness and a curiosity about understanding other points of view and honoring those points of view. And I think that's a really important distinction. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
So this has been a great conversation, Leo, and I really appreciate, for my own self personally, having a much better understanding of what DEI is and how to navigate that in a human way. And so I think you've added a lot of clarity for me and for our audience. As we wrap this up, I'm always curious about people's learnings over their careers. And so when you were first getting into this field, and it's fascinating to me that at such an early age, you knew this was the area I wanted to be in. I find that so interesting. But I suspect there were things you thought back then, and now having lived more years, we're not going to tell the audience how old you are, but having lived more years and having more experience, there are some things that you look back and say, man, I was so naive about that. I have a whole different point of view about that today. What would be like the biggest thing you think you've learned now that you didn't know back then?
Wow. It's interesting. I was having a conversation about this the other day. And I would say the biggest thing, and it goes back to this idea of right and wrong, right? I used to have this belief that you can get to everything through reason. You can reason it out. And so I started when I was going on DEI that I'm going to get the best arguments for why people should do things and believe things. And so that I could overcome discrimination and bias with the right arguments. They're going to figure those arguments out. Then I'm going to bring them to people and they're going to be persuaded and the world will gradually move. Human beings do not work that way at all. Like that is something, one of my undergrad degrees in philosophy, right? Everything was logic and reason.
That was my major, by the way.
Oh, there you go. And so I used to think, and interestingly, my undergrad was in philosophy and then religion, dual majors, which may seem, like they were in conflict, but they were really just about, what are the different ways in which human beings experience and move through the world, right? And so I really appreciated that perspective and that contrast. Anyway, I really thought that if you had really great arguments, they would be persuasive to people. And it's been an evolution. And I think it's only probably a decade ago now that I remember the science that came out that validated people make emotional commitments to things, and then they back those up with arguments. And so your arguments are not going to be effective. And this was at a time when I was having a lot of arguments with people in person and online about, here's why your theories are flawed. And so I think that, how that has informed where I'm at right now and how I come at this work is really there's a lot of humility, just want to get someone else's experience and to recognize that if somebody has a really emotional commitment to something, the thing that I can do is just really get that they have that commitment to that belief. I'm not going to necessarily overcome that by any kinds of arguments. What I can begin to look for is where are there points of intersection between where your beliefs are and where I am, your experience and my experience. If we're going to be able to be in community at all, and this is if we're in an organizational culture or in a country, we have to think about, what are our points of intersection? And how do we meet at those point of intersections and honor one another experiences in ways that leave one another whole? Because we're just not all going to agree. And we've just got to understand that.
And interestingly, to your point, there usually are more points of intersection than we recognize. We're just so focused on the points of difference.
That's exactly right.
Fascinating.
And we highlight and magnify and misidentify, as we do with DEI, that those points of disagreement are the whole thing.
Yes. And that's the disservice, I think, that the use of labels often has. When we use a label for something or somebody, they're a racist, they're a patriot, they're this, they're that, they're a conservative, they're a liberal, they're a Democrat, they're a Republican. As soon as we use that label, we attach all kinds of other things to it, and none of us are that label. We're just a whole mix of different points of view, and we fail to see, I think, often those points of commonality or of intersection, as you say it, because we've labeled them as a certain thing, and that icon means something to us, which is usually inaccurate.
And we forget, and I think this is the beauty of DEI, is that we are not just any one thing. We are a constellation of things. I have a race, but I also have an age. I have the physical abilities and disabilities that I have. I have the income level that I have. I have the educational level. So I'm all these things. So there's likely, if we can sit as human beings, we're going to find that we may have many more points of intersection, right? You and I just found out we both majored in philosophy. We're going to have many more points of intersection, likely, given that we live in the same time and we live in the same country. There's going to be so much more about us where we can say, okay, well, we can align on the things that we want than in those things that we disagree. Those things that we disagree may be important. They may be formative for us, and we get to honor them, but not at the disservice of all the other places in which we might find commonality. And we'll never get to that so long as we're only focused on those places where we disagree.
Great way of summing that up. Leo, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating, and not just fascinating, but tremendously useful conversation. So I thank you personally, and I thank you on behalf of our audience. Thanks so much for being with us.
It's been a pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.
You bet. And that's it for today's episode of Culture Architects with Leo Sanders. If you found this conversation to be helpful, be sure to subscribe, and that way new episodes are waiting for you each week. And leave us a review to help other leaders find the show as well. And for more tools on building a high-performing culture in your organization, just visit CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.